Welcome to the slow night. As the world grows quiet, we travel back in time to a remote, snow-covered village in old Korea. Tonight's tale is Affection by the master of Korean tragicomedy, Kim Yu-jeong. It is a story of a man lost in the bitter cold of poverty and the flickering warmth of a forbidden desire. Close your eyes and let the sound of my voice guide you through the frozen hills and the scent of a wood-burning stove. The story begins now. Affection, Kim Yu-jeong. All that remained to be taken out now were a large wooden basin and a winnowing basket. The sieves and other vessels were either broken or worn out, rendered utterly useless. Even to take those few things out, he would have to deceive his wife's eyes, but she sat right across from him, staring blankly, making it impossible for him to budge. However, he figured if he provoked her temper today, she would storm out of her own accord in a fit of rage. Yoon-sik, sitting in the lower part of the room, sat in silence with his legs pulled up and his head hanging low after the dinner table had been cleared. It was because a clever pretext had not yet come to mind. The draft coming down from the upper room made even the lower room bitterly cold. It would have been good if he had repaired the ceiling in the autumn. Now, clumps of dirt dripped from the ceiling as the cold wind whistled through. Wrapped in tattered rags, his young son whimpered in front of the brazier. His wife sat beside the child, comforting him while feeding him roasted potatoes. With her legs stretched sideways and her body twisting, she looked exhausted, her body worn out from a day of labor at the treadmill. She did nothing but yawn repeatedly. After a long while, the husband lifted his head and scouted his wife's mood. Then, contorting his thick lips, he blurted out roughly, "Did someone come by earlier today?" "Who else but the village clerk?" his wife replied indifferently, not even looking up. Of course, he had already run into the clerk on the street earlier, who was coming to demand the long-overdue household tax. He had deliberately avoided his home for fear of getting into trouble if caught, but since he needed to start an argument anyway, he said, "If he has business, he should call for me. Why did you let that fellow into the room? What were you two doing in here?" He forced his eyes to glare. His wife snapped her head up, her eyes flashing. She looked utterly dumbfounded. Pouting, she lifted her chin slightly, then dropped it again, silently continuing to feed the child potatoes. Thinking this was enough of a start, he stoked the fire of his feigned anger once more. "If there's something to be said, it should be said outside. Why drag him all the way into the room? Listen to you. Talk about not knowing someone's heart. Think of the trouble I went through to make excuses for you." His wife's dark face flushed with veins of anger, but she couldn't settle on an expression. After a moment, she stared straight into her husband's face. "Instead of that, why don't you boil some straw shoes every night and go pay the tax?" Then, after a pause, she muttered to herself in a barely audible voice, "Just because he's obsessed with a woman, he's hauling all the household goods out." "Who's hauling household goods out?" He feigned innocence and jumped with indignation. But inside, he felt a sharp pang. He thought she didn't know, but it seemed she had already figured everything out. When he realized that his theft of his wife's undergarments the night before last and the millstone the night before that had been discovered, he felt incredibly unpleasant. "Who told you such a thing? They'll be struck by lightning." The young wife simply pulled the child toward her to breastfeed, refusing to engage further. It seemed she was suppressed by jealousy and resentment, holding back a torrent of harsh words that threatened to burst out. "I'm asking, who said such a thing?" "Who else? It was Cheol-soi's mother." "What did she say?" "That you've fallen for that itinerant drifter woman, that's what. She said you're stealing the millstone and my undergarments to buy her drinks." The husband's face suddenly turned beet red. While his wife struggled and braved hardships just to survive, the husband was stealing her clothes to buy liquor. No matter how one looked at it, it was shameful behavior. He felt a sting of conscience to have avoided his wife's gaze, yet he felt that if he let his will be broken here, he wouldn't be acting like a husband. "They're saying things they didn't even see. Are they blind?" He raised his voice as a defense. However, seeing that it had no effect, he grew irritated. He subtly shifted the target of his words. "And what about you? What were you doing lying around with that fellow in broad daylight?" He turned the accusation back on her. At these words, the wife's eyes filled with venom. She shoved the breastfeeding child onto the floor and stood up abruptly. It was heartbreaking that he ignored her efforts and only threw tantrums. As if she had grown tired of being alone in the cold room, she calmly tucked in her skirt and walked out of the house with a swish. The child began to wail loudly. As soon as the sound of his wife's footsteps treading on the snow faded into the distance, his mind was at ease. He opened the door and crept out. No matter what he did now, there would be no one to see. He fumbled his way into the kitchen, struck a match, and looked around. Just as he thought, the wooden basin was waiting for its owner on the furnace. After dumping the potato scraps inside back onto the spot, he hoisted it up and went to the backyard. If he went out through the front and got caught by his wife, there would be hell to pay. He climbed the hill behind the house and tossed it over the fence. Then, as if he had just come out to relieve himself, he walked toward the brushwood gate and leisurely looked around. There was nothing but white snow. Leaning against the fence, he reached over, picked up the basin, and took off running. Yoon-sik avoided the houses and circled around the foot of the mountain. Since he held the basin tight against his body, there was no fear of being caught. The bitterly cold moon opened its eyes wide in the blue sky. The stream flowing through Suarigol had now frozen over, glinting sharply. And everything, the mountains, fields, houses, and straw stacks, was submerged in layers of snow, not even making the sound of a breath. As he was coming out of the mountain path toward the street, the sound of a gong rang out from somewhere. It vibrated faintly through the lonely night air. He stopped in his tracks and stood blankly. He had completely forgotten that tonight was the general meeting of the Promotion Association. In this village, it was the custom that if you didn't attend once, you were fined 5 cents, and on top of that, they would burden you with grueling communal labor. He thought to himself that if he just said he was sick, that would be that, but he still felt uneasy. This Promotion Association, it wasn't as if they allocated land to those who had none or provided any means of living. All they did was grab a starving man and make him labor to repair the roads, or call a weary man and pester him with lectures all night long. As someone already hounded by poverty, he had been planning to leave the village for a long time out of sheer annoyance, but he had no place to go. However, he was grateful that the association had swept up all the young men of the village tonight. Tonight, he could have the itinerant woman all to himself. When he neared the tavern, he felt not only joy but a surge of courage. It was a house sitting solitary and secluded by the roadside. Standing beside the mountain bend, its tracks were faint in the snow, but in the moonlight, it cast a slender tail of a shadow. To the west, hidden in the shadows, the main gate stood open, and beside it was a paper screen door where a lamp flickered. This was the room Gaesuk was renting. When he swung the door open and stepped in, the woman stood up and welcomed him. "What's this wooden basin for?" Her attitude and the way she gave a shallow smile hadn't changed at all since they first met 3 days ago. Her words last night, saying she loved him, must have been her sincere, solid heart. Truly, affection is a strange thing. "Why are you laughing?" "I brought it to pay for last night's drinks," he said, though he felt a bit embarrassed. He watched for a moment as the woman took it, looking pleased. "That thing, it's worth more than 2 jang unit of currency value." He smiled back at her. Gaesuk's joyful face was the entirety of his happiness. The woman took the basin out through the inner door and soon returned carrying a table of food and drink. It was a gesture to have a drink first, regardless of the drink's price or whether he had asked for it. While pouring the rice wine, which had been slightly warmed over the brazier, she said, "Hurry and drink. That's how your body will thaw." She even held it to his lips. He gulped it down in one breath. 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups. The woman sat close beside him and tucked Yoon-sik's frozen hands into her bosom. She seemed to pity him. Leaning her head, she said, "I'm leaving tomorrow," showing her regret at their parting. She had wanted to stay longer, but the head of the Promotion Association had come. He told her they wouldn't tolerate an itinerant woman for the sake of the village and ordered her to leave at once. However, since there was nowhere to go at night, she had said she would leave as soon as it was light tomorrow. Yoon-sik felt as if his world had collapsed and was dazed. He knew she would leave eventually, but he never dreamed she would be hurried off so suddenly. If they were separated, how was he to live? Gi-suk did have a husband, the father of the child lying in the lower part of the room. He was a man who did nothing but drink and gamble and would beat his wife at the slightest provocation to take whatever money she earned, so she had separated from him 3 months ago. In that case, it would be fine for her to live openly with him. But he felt too awkward to say such words. Then what about me? Should I follow you? Then let's do that, she accepted readily, as if she had been waiting for those words. But what about the wife you have at home? Don't worry about that. Yoon-sik, emboldened, pulled the woman into his arms. Getting rid of his wife was easy. If he just left her be, she could go wherever she pleased. He was only happy with the thought of a new life, earning a living by following Gi-suk around. We have to leave before it gets light so we don't get caught. Even though it was late, there were no other drinkers. After latching the door and blowing out the lamp, they lay down. The woman threw herself into Yoon-sik's arms and let out a long sigh. If we're going to set up a household, we'll need some dishes and things. I'll go to my house and bring some. He had no hesitation. Once his wife was fast asleep, he would go in and snatch this and that would be it. The thought that from tomorrow he would live comfortably without hunger made his heart throb so much he couldn't sleep. The draft was freezing. It seemed the landlord was unkind and hadn't lit a fire in the room. Lying on a coarse straw mat, they held each other tightly to warm their shivering bodies. The child, who had been pushed into a corner, woke up. When he whimpered and tried to crawl between them, the mother scolded him, and he went back to his spot and lay down without a peep. He was a very well-trained infant. Yoon-sik hated that brat. If we work ourselves to death gathering things, that fellow will just spend it all. He'll gamble like his father and beat his mother to take her money. If that happens, wouldn't I just be wasting my efforts like the man in the legend who played Go with immortals until his axe handle rotted? Thinking this, he felt it wouldn't even be a pity if the child froze to death right then. However, to win the mother's favor, he couldn't help but pat the child's bottom once or twice, saying, "Oh, what a good boy he is." The moon tilted, lighting up the paper screen door. Occasionally, the sound of hoofbeats came from the stable. An ill omen entered their peaceful, all sleep at an ungodly hour. A man named Mung Tai came and called for the woman in a low voice, rattling the door to be let in. As a regular who spent money on Gi-suk, his influence was formidable. Yoon-sik furrowed his brow, but when the woman whispered, "I'll talk to him for a moment and send him away, so go out and wait," he felt reassured. He took those words as a sign of her trust in him as her husband. He slipped out through the inner door like the wind and pressed his body against the wall of the room. Yoon-sik strained his ears to overhear the conversation in the room. Mung Tai entered and asked, "Did that fellow come today too?" When the woman said no one had come, he scoffed loudly, saying, "Why is that bastard acting so crazy and restless lately?" That fellow referred to Yoon-sik himself. As he prattled on, he brought up every flaw of Yoon-sik's. How his reputation in the village was terrible. How even his wife went around bad-mouthing her husband because she hated him, and how Gi-suk was a thieving woman who would ruin a household. Every time, the woman responded flirtatiously and laughed along with him. Then they whispered in voices as soft as chicks so that no one else could hear. Yoon-sik's anger flared, and his breathing grew ragged. But there was nothing he could do. It was incredibly hurtful that Gi-suk didn't even stand up for him and seemed to be in league with the man. Between the rage and the cold, he folded his arms and shivered violently. Standing in the snow with socks full of holes, his feet throbbed with a piercing numbness. Suddenly, the thought of his wife crossed his mind. If he just went home, a warm embrace would be waiting for him. Why was he suffering like this? But he hated his wife. A cripple who couldn't even sing a verse of arirang, a fool who couldn't earn a single penny. To be sure, in the beginning, their affection had been deep enough to ignore fire and water, but now it had all withered away. Even if an itinerant drifter woman who moved from one man's arms to another's was considered lowly, how envious he was of the way she ate without having to labor. To handle all those men who came at her with drooling mouths, that was a noble prestige in its own right. His teeth chattered in the freezing cold. Even so, he waited desperately to be called back in, his chin propped up and his eyes nearly popping out from the weight. The woman said at the inner door, "Go safely. Let's meet later." "Yeah, I'll come by again soon." As soon as she sent Mungtai away, she spoke toward the other door. "Come in quietly." She pulled Unsik inside. He rushed in and rubbed his frozen hands together vigorously. "That bastard, why is he acting so high and mighty when he's just a nobody?" "I know, right? He has no sense at all." The woman was consistently smooth, without a single gap. She turned up the lamp and smiled brightly, looking a bit tipsy. "Why is that guy like that? Just telling lies constantly," Yunsik said, paying back the insults he had overheard. He claimed Mungtae was a vagabond with no money or credit, that he had been severely punished for being caught in an affair, and even made up a story that he had been caught stealing someone's rice and had served time in prison. While he was bragging like this to deceive the woman, he was suddenly startled. The first cock-crow rang out loudly from the inner village. Time was running out. He rubbed the woman's cheek and stood up abruptly. "I'm going out for a bit. You must wait, okay?" Yunsik quietly pushed open the brushwood gate of his own house. The moon had completely set. The only light came from the reflection of the snow on the yard. First, he stepped onto the veranda and pressed his ear to the room door. Deep breathing, his wife was fast asleep. Only then did he feel relieved and enter the kitchen. Feeling his way, he put his foot on the furnace and pulled out the large cooking pot. It was the pot that had contracted their happiness when he had taken his wife 4 years ago. But the sweet dream had lasted only a few months, followed by nothing but grinding poverty. Now it was only right that it be moved elsewhere. In the basket hanging on the kitchen wall, there were 3 spoons. He left the one for Deoki, his son, and tucked the other 2 into his waistband. There were about 3 or 4 liters of millet in the room, but if he tried to get that, things might go wrong. Though it felt insufficient, he slipped out like a shadow. It was the very end of the Suarigol Valley. The house sat by the stream, wedged between 2 mountains, in a lonely spot. Whenever there was business in the center of the village, he had to struggle up and down the rocky path by the stream. But now that he was saying goodbye to it, he felt a strange sense of fondness and regret. He looked back at the house where he had lived a couple of times and then ran quickly toward the tavern. "Come in quickly. You're cold, aren't you?" Jisuk welcomed him with a dazed smile. She hadn't even lain down, busying herself with preparations to leave. Following the woman's suggestion, the luggage was tied into a single bundle. They just had to shoulder it as soon as the dawn broke. If they dithered in the morning, they would be discovered by the tavern owner, and rumors would spread through the village. Moreover, if his wife came chasing after them, it would be a shameful sight. With the preparations for departure finished, he lay down facing the woman. They pressed their bodies together to ward off the cold, but they shivered just the same. It needs to get light soon. As he thought this, he fell into a brief, deep sleep. He didn't know what time it was. He opened his eyes because the child was whimpering and crawling over his head. Just as he was about to push the child away irritably, an unfamiliar voice came from the upper part of the room behind his back. "Come here. Daddy's here." A gruff, booming voice. It must be the original husband she had abandoned, come back in a fit of rage. Yunsik felt as if he were dreaming. Terrified, he couldn't move an inch while lying down. A husband's rage upon catching his wife's lover in the act would be the same everywhere. If the man came at him with a sickle, he would have no choice but to die without a sound. His back felt stiff. Not knowing what else to do, he poked Gaesuk in the belly a few times with his finger, hoping waking her would settle things. But the woman just hugged his waist tighter and slept soundly, oblivious to the world. Cold sweat poured from him. The husband walked toward them from behind. Picking up the child, he said, "Why are you being so bothersome? Go back to sleep and rest well," as he went back to the upper part of the room. Even though his tone was very gentle and he seemed good-natured, it felt like his skin was being sliced. After a while, the woman woke up. "We have to leave now," she said, rubbing her eyes, Then she looked toward the upper part of the room and gasped in shock. Then she fell silent, keeping her mouth shut. Day had fully broken. In the kitchen, the owner was washing a pot. The landlord coughed and opened the main gate with a creak. The situation had completely changed. Yoon-sik also stood up and sat huddled, waiting to see what would happen to him. Glancing sideways, he saw a tall, rough-looking man, not particularly fierce but with an air of hidden strength, sitting in the upper part of the room with the child in his arms, sitting cross-legged. "Let's get moving." The horse driver stood up, handed the child to the woman, and then held out a hand toward Yoon-sik. "Hey, friend, stand up and help me with this pack." Yoon-sik had no choice but to do as he was told. Although it was the pack he was supposed to carry, he assisted the man in shouldering it. Since it contained the pot, the millstone, the wooden basin, and other bundles tied together, it was quite heavy. However, the husband didn't seem to find it heavy at all. He looked light-hearted, smiling and strolling out. The woman also followed, carrying the child in a wrap on her back. Yoon-sik was dazed, as if watching a dream. He followed slowly behind them to see what they were doing. The morning air was even more piercing. The wind scooped up the snow from the ground and blew it repeatedly into his face. As they rounded the mountain bend and were about to descend the hill, the husband looked back at Yoon-sik and said, "Why are you standing there? Let's go together." He had no desire to accompany them. He stood there blankly without answering. Just then, from a side path at the mountain bend, Yoon-sik's wife came rushing out. She was so breathless her mouth hung open, but no words came out. Gasping, her face turning bright red, she lunged at the woman. "Why are you taking someone else's pot?" The villagers, rubbing their sleepy eyes, came out to watch. Standing at a distance, they huddled together, whispering and pointing. "No, it's not! It's not!" Yoon-sik's face burned with shame as he tried to pull his wife away. But she would not stop her outburst. She hurled curses. However, the itinerant couple seemed to be deaf. One with the pack and the other with the child on her back walked boldly down the hill without once looking back. Overwhelmed with rage, the wife collapsed onto the snow and began to wail. Yoon-sik could only glance at the onlookers and smack his lips. Finally, he grabbed his wife to pull her up, his own face twisted as if he were about to cry. "Hey, I told you it's not our pot, so why are you like this?" A stolen iron pot, a runaway lover, and a husband's pathetic lie echoing in the snow. What is this thing we call affection? Is it a bond that warms us or a chain that binds us? Perhaps in the end we are all just wandering through the cold, looking for a place to rest. May your heart find its home tonight away from the biting wind. Sleep peacefully and let the ancient tales watch over your dreams. Good night.